everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you to this installment of the Trade and Economic Development Unit's National Conversations. This evening's panel will be discussing some of their projections with regards to the national budget. The national budget will be read on the 5th of October 2020, and I believe the nation is waiting to see where this economy is going. The budget is one of those national development tools that signals to the population some of the intentions of the government. Given where we are globally and nationally, I believe that this evening's conversation is definitely going to be an eye-opener. It is important for us as civil society to remember our role, that is to be able to put information out into the public in a way that is consumable, that empowers them to be able to make better decisions. This evening's panel includes Dr. Roger Hossain, Ms. Anita Haynes, Dr. Boendranath Tawari, Ms. Denise Deming, and Mr. Robert Lee Hunt. For those participants who are just joining us, may I invite you to mute your mic. This will reduce the feedback on our conversations. And a little later on, you may ask questions and post your comments directly to the panelists. Dr. Hussain will be presenting first, and at this time, I would like to hand over to him. Dr. Hussain, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So, good night, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Right, so I will get straight into it.
Dr. Hussain, you can use presentation view, please.
We are just at the doorstep of another budget reading in Trinidad and Tobago, and it's a very concerning time for the country. Certainly for us at the university, we see this as a very trying time period, and there are quite a few things that needs to be addressed and needs fixing in the economy. I won't spend much time on this slide. I will speak to some of them as I go along. What I would like to do, though, is to explain where I think we are. I read the economic recovery phase 1, and I looked at the part of the phase 2 document that was online, and it is a good document. It left me with some concerns from a conceptual perspective, and I shared these concerns with a couple members of the team, and hopefully if there is a phase 3 version of the document, it would be addressed there, or else we would put it in the public domain and hope that the powers that be look at it and try to improve. Now, where are we? Point A is where the economy was in March 2020. So in March 2020, we had a situation where we produced a certain amount of non-tradable goods, NT, and a certain amount of tradable goods, T. The tradable goods, of course, have several parts: booming tradable, which is oil, and non-booming tradable, which is the service sector, the manufacturing sector, export, agriculture, and sectors that generate export revenue. COVID came and the economy was moved from point A to point B because of social distancing and other such requirements in order to keep people alive. After point B, the economy started to open back up, and we opened back up bars and casinos and cinemas and restaurants and whatnot. We have had some changes in the last few weeks, but altogether, we are much more open today than in terms of the period of lockdown. Where should we put this economy now that we are opening it up? Should we go back to A? Should we go back to C? Or should we go to D? A is not a good point that we should go back to. A is a point characterized by high and rising unemployment, a high and rising debt, high and rising debt per capita, high debt to GDP ratio, fiscal account imbalances, balance of payments problem, contracting GDP growth, and a host of other such problems. So I would recommend that the state not go back to A and instead think this economy through to take it in a different place. I note that we have, with the economic recovery phase 1 and the parts of phase 2 that I saw, that we seem to be drifting towards part C. And I raised this with some of the members of the elite team, and I hope that it is somehow taken on board, because I think part C is even worse than part A. We cannot afford to be drifting towards an economy with a greater participation of the non-tradable sector. We simply can't afford, because the non-tradable sector has a high correlation with imported goods. And as you would see later on, our stock of reserves and our fiscal balance is related in part to where we locate in terms of A, C, and D. What I think is the way forward is point D. And point D is one characterized by producing more of the booming tradable good or the export good
Dr. Hussein?
I haven't been hearing him for some time, you know.
I am not sure what's going on. I think perhaps he's having some issues. Just give me a second. Let me see if I can deal with it.
Hello.
Yeah, we now hearing you, Roger.
Rebecca, I got a message saying the host muted everyone. Anyway, so I'm continuing, all right?
Yes, Dr. Hussein, I don't think we heard the last
Did you all get this slide?
5 minutes of your last 3 minutes of your conversation.
Did you hear this slide?
No.
Okay, was this finished?
Not the end of it.
Okay, so I think we should go to point D. Point D is one characterized by a greater production of booming tradable goods and non-booming tradable goods, of which the non-booming tradable goods has a manufacturing part, an agricultural part, and a services part. Now, this year reminds me of the Trinidad and Tobago economy at present. You know, there are a lot of close-in fields, man. That's probably me or the tan bowling. And if you want to make some runs in this situation, you have to hit that ball over the infield. And I was saying this to another group recently. I think that's how the Trinidad and Tobago policymakers have to view economic activity in Trinidad and Tobago right now. They can't leave it to fate. They can't leave it to employment status, depression. They have to hit the ball over the infield. And I will explain what that means shortly. Now, we are in a situation, and it's a painful situation. It's one in which from 2008 to 2020, we produced 4 billion barrels of oil and gas equivalent, and the economy contracted 18%. And you know, I have 3 young kids, and whenever I see this and I talk to my students at university, I always ask the question, what am I going to tell them? How am I going to explain that we had a set of big people running this country for X years, and they crashed the economy, and 4 billion barrels of oil and gas is gone, and no, I don't even think people would say sorry. So it leaves me perturbed and disturbed. And on top of all of that, we have to battle this thing with COVID-19, which is wreaking havoc throughout the global economy. So it's a really tight situation. And you know, people, it's such a tight situation that if we were to try to manage this situation, we have to find a way to fix this non-energy fiscal balance, which is about, I think it could be as much as about 30 billion this year. And because the overall fiscal balance, the Minister of Finance has said would be about 14 billion. So we have a very Herculean task on our hands now. In dealing with these matters, I think that one of the main conversation has to be the fallen foreign exchange reserves. And we need to ask the question, how can we generate more foreign exchange reserves? And this is linked directly to the point D that I mentioned earlier in terms of production space, where we would have to be located. Increasing foreign direct inflows is a problem, but the crime wave in the economy, the poor performance of the ease of doing business, the worker ethic in the country are restrictive factors. And indeed, I am glad that Robert is here and Anita is here with us, and maybe they can pass on the message to the relevant people in the relevant places, because it was a tremendous endogenous policy error, allowing the ease of doing business to slide backward from 66 to 105 today. That's our doing. That's not somebody in North America and London. That's our error. And it's an error we have to fix. So how can we increase export energy? We can increase exploration. We can increase production of stranded gas. We could push the lease out, farm out, which is a low-hanging fruit as far as I'm concerned. We could unlock the potential of renewable energy so that we could release more gas for use in petrochemical and other places. We could improve energy efficiency as well. More importantly, I think the question is how we could, or just as importantly, the question is how we could improve non-energy exports. And something that stands out to me here in this long list of items is the ease of doing business. And we have 3 people here on this conversation that I hope when their turn comes will answer this question for us. Why didn't we improve the ease of doing business? Why have we allowed the ease of doing business to move from 66 to 105? That's like saying you are batting and somebody is bowling and you put your bat 10 feet away from your leg, so obviously the ball can pass between bat and pad. I mean, it's a glaring policy error, and I hope one of the 3 policy makers on this chat could comment. The other matter is, I don't understand why we have so much Venezuelans here, about 50,000, and yet still we refuse, although I did see the PNM manifesto have a clause where they plan to use some of the Venezuelan workers as seasonal workers. I think we need to stop talking about it and start to act. And The third point I would emphasize is the acceleration of the special economic zone policy that could help to make a long-term difference. I just outline here some items that the European Union classify as luxury imports, and because these are some of the things we simply cannot afford to spend money on. So I listed there, the PowerPoint would be available to all via Rebecca if you all are so interested. This is the ease of doing business ranking here. I spoke about this earlier today as well somewhere else. And it shows that in starting a business, dealing with construction permit, getting electricity, although registering property improved, it is very bad at a high level. Getting credit, protecting minority investors, paying taxes, trading across borders is terrible. And the whole range. And how could we, as leaders in our community, allow that distance between bat and pad that makes it so easy to get bold? It doesn't make sense to me, and I hope someone can clarify that as we go along. This here is the relationship between manufacturing exports and the ease of doing business. And so if we were to improve the ease of doing business ranking, non-booming tradable exports such as manufacturing can increase, because the higher the rank on the ease of doing business is the lower you are really placed. So you don't want to get a rank of say 105 like Trinidad and Tobago. You want to get a rank closer to one like Norway. This shows the same thing for services exports. And so it reinforces the earlier point. And one of the things I think we should do is look at the top 50 ranking in the world and pick the developing countries that form part of those rankings. And these are the countries here. And again, we take a simple approach. We look at these 10 countries and we see what they implemented and what we can learn and apply to Trinidad and Tobago. I cannot at all understand why it is we as big people, as serious people wanting to help our people, are not taking these basic steps. And I looked at Jamaica in detail, and I pulled out some of the things that Jamaica did to become the top ranked Caribbean country, and I offer it here as a suggestion. So all I will do here is I will stop here. I threw out some ideas there, and I focused on the ease of doing business as a main high priority focal point to crowding domestic capital, given that private sector, that foreign capital may be a bit strained in the next 3 years to obtain. And I will stop there and let others continue, and I will take some questions after. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Hussain, thank you very much. You know, I read once that economics is the language of public policy. Our budget is one of those primary tools by which public policy is communicated to the population. And looking and assimilating your presentation, Dr. Hussain, we can definitely keep an eye on where the economy is going. Some of those key performance indicators that you highlighted is definitely going to enable sustainable development in Trinidad and Tobago. But I would like to now hand over to the rest of our panel, starting with Ms. Haynes, who perhaps may bring, or will definitely bring, an alternative perspective in terms of the economics, but really add value to our conversation this afternoon. Ms. Haynes?
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Good night, everyone. I'm glad to see so many persons tuned in for this very important discussion. When we met in an analysis of the mid-year review, I raised the point that I'm always excited at the possibility for increased consultation between policymakers, legislators, and members of the public. I think that is critical in how we treat with our politics and policymaking going forward. Consultation is very, very key component. And as you rightfully said, Rebecca, how we communicate what we are doing as arms of government and what that means to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I am honored to be part of the panel, and I sit here tonight as not just as myself, but as a representative I've been elected to represent the people of Tamaki, the constituency of Tamaki, in the House of Representatives. And I take that role very seriously. And that's the focus of my discussion here tonight. When I was asked to join the panel, we were talking about our projections for the budget for fiscal 2021. And since my swearing in on August 28th and the opening of the office last week, I have been met with a number of concerns from the residents across, and this constituency is very large, it is extremely diverse. There are a lot of competing interests and a lot of very similar interests across the constituency. When Dr. Hussein was presenting, he made the point that how is he to explain what has happened over the years to his children? I am a younger politician coming into this space, hoping to make a very big difference, hoping to be a voice for a change in the way things are done. And it is critical, I think, for this generation of Trinidadians and Tobagonians to have an active and loud voice in policymaking and to take up every avenue that we have to advocate for changes in policy, because we've sat on the sidelines, we've seen things go a certain way, and as Dr. Hussein rightfully said, we are now going to be asked to pay the bills, basically, as we go forward. When I listened to Dr. Hussein talk about the ease of doing business, and I understand the concerns for macroeconomic policy, what people are looking forward to would be whether or not there would be some alleviation on the strain on the population of Trinidad and Tobago. In the week that I have opened my office since receiving the keys from Parliament, I have been inundated with messages and calls and visits about persons who are quite simply seeking an opportunity to work, an opportunity to earn a living in Trinidad and Tobago right now is very difficult. So people will be listening on. Dr. Hussein raised it as the ease of doing business, but people are going to be looking on October 5th, 2020, to find out if there's going to be a space where they can see opportunities for job creation, for them to be able to earn a living and take their families forward. And we would also be looking on very closely what we are hoping for. Now, nobody has been living under a rock. We understand what COVID-19 has done to economies globally. But what we as a population need to say and what we need to look on is, let us not use COVID-19 as an excuse, but let us look at it as an opportunity. Let us look at it as an opportunity to innovate, to be creative, to look critically at what has been done before and what absolutely needs to be done differently at this time. And let us be inclusive in our consultation. Do not limit it to small groups of people. Make it wide. Bring enough people to decision-making table, because there are a lot of people in Trinidad and Tobago with a lot of very great ideas who are willing to work for our country. And we have to ensure, in preparation for today, I actually looked at all the past budgets of this Minister of Finance, all of his budget presentations. I don't know, his first budget statement was actually also on October 5th, 2015. It was entitled Restoring Trust and Rebuilding Our Confidence. And in the last paragraph of that budget statement, there was a promise for increased consultation across all stakeholders, because every voice is important and every voice matters. We have 5 years of analysis now. We would have seen what has occurred over the past 5 years. My role is not to rehash any of that, I don't think. But it is to say that come October 5th, 2020, the population of Trinidad and Tobago will be tuned in, we will be looking on. We've heard talk about increased taxes, etc. And what we're saying is, well, you have to also now meet us halfway and increase service delivery an increase of access to opportunities, and let us as citizens feel like active parts of policy making and not just people who decisions are handed down to. And that is how I will approach not just the budget debate, but all the scrutiny of the budget documents to ensure that whatever we are doing and saying would redound to the benefits of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And that's our role as policymakers, and it's certainly our role as representatives. So I look forward to this discussion. I look forward to hearing opinions and voices across the board as we try to make our country, rise from the crisis that we've been facing, but using COVID-19 as an opportunity as opposed to an excuse for why things could not be better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Haynes. Definitely on this panel, you are the voice of the youth. So at this time, I want to hand over the conversation to a stalwart in terms of his political career. Dr. Tawari, you can unmute your mic and make your presentation.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Dr. Tawari. Go ahead.
Right, excellent. Well, good evening, everybody. Rebecca, you, Anita, Roger, Denise, and Robert. I feel good to be on a panel with all of you, all knowledgeable people, different perspectives, different skills. And I want to depart a little bit from the conversation so far because I think what we are dealing here with a situation in which we have context, right? Which is we had a government that was in office for 5 years, notwithstanding the performance of that government, economic progress. They have been returned to office, and really they have a fresh mandate, although a narrow majority. And there is an opportunity for that government to take a different approach than they did before, so that I see this as a possible point of departure. I think there is opportunity for a change of attitude, a change of tone, a change of disposition. But not only do we have a new government, we are caught in the middle of a community spread. We are fighting the possibility of a second lockdown, and the whole world is waiting for a vaccine. And meantime, we have to get on with the business of survival and coping and economic progress. So if the government wants to make a fresh start, I think this is a good opportunity to start with what you might call parliamentary honesty and accountability in order to make that fresh start. So that I think it is important, although some of this is in documents in various places, but we will never have documents up to date in the present time. And that is only under the custodianship of any government. I think it is important, if we are to make a fresh start, for the government through the Minister of Finance to come to the country, give us a sense of the state of the country's finances, the state of the country's debt obligation, both government debt and contingent liabilities, the extent of COVID expenditure, the sources of funding, the number of beneficiaries, a realistic assessment of the number of businesses that have closed since COVID, a realistic assessment of the level of joblessness in the society, a realistic report on how financing from the credit unions and financing from the banks in the context of government arranged facilities with the credit union sector and the banking sector are actually working out. And an explanation to the population of what a shrunken economy means in terms of livelihoods and quality of life. I mean, people are feeling it, they know it, but I think it's important for the government to explain what this means in terms of how they see the policy options. Secondly, COVID is not a national thing, it's an international thing in which we are caught. And the entire economic situation in which we are caught up involves international affairs and geopolitical decisions. The price of oil, for instance, is related to that. The COVID pandemic is related to that. The disruption of supply chains is related to that. All of these are outside of our control. But we have things within the country that are in our control. But we have to do the things internally, but we also have to keep faith with various entities that are international in nature, to whom we lean on for support. Multilateral institutions. They have responded in the COVID crisis by mobilizing financial resources and making them available in the form of loans and grants. And I think we need to bring them into the conversation as we end the discussion on the budget. And we must have a plan in order to do that. We must have a fiscal plan as well as a developmental plan. And we must be able to indicate how this expenditure pattern is going to change, let's say over the next 3 years. And I feel it is important to bring them into the picture. I think it is also important to bring the rating agencies into the picture. We've been downgraded 3 times in the last 5 years. And what we need is an upward swing, which can growth and revitalization of the economy. And just as we need the multilaterals to help support the financing needs that we may have over the next 3 years or so, maybe more than that, we also need the rating agencies to work with us to upgrade our rating so we may end up getting the investment space and the financial space that we need internationally as we go forward and as we go into a situation of recovery and hopefully growth. So the other thing I want to mention is the fact that we have a pending disaster on the outside in the Gulf, which has implications for a number of things. I think if we took a strong stand on that, we could assert ourselves nationally. We could revise our foreign policy position in the hemisphere and the world system in relation to Venezuela. We could take a very strong stand on climate change, sustainable development, environmental issues as an energy producing country. And I think we get an opportunity also to leverage that for policy that we might need to focus on going forward, which is to say a greener policy with which is climate change responsive, environmentally sensitive, which moves away from fossil fuel energy. Even the energy companies are doing that now. And I think that the things that I'm mentioning here are things that I feel we need to do even before the budget. The budget is October 5th. We have a couple of weeks before that, and that we need to do some things to change the tone of governance, the attitude towards governing, and the disposition of the government to its citizens and to its stakeholders. And finally, I would say that the government, through the Minister of Finance, has been inviting people, various stakeholders, stakeholders to send in suggestions for the budget for possible inclusion. And I think the government needs to make a commitment that after the budget is read, these consultations will be structured and continue as part of a plan in which the government will keep its multilateral financiers within the framework, the credit agencies within the framework, the national stakeholders within the framework would be very, very clear on its green policy in relation to environmental issues and green industries moving away from fossil fuels. And it can then, as it presents its budget, begin to address the transparency issue and the change in attitude and tone issue as the basis for a new start in terms of improving the quality and transparency of governance in Trinidad and Tobago. A fresh start. I think that some of these things that I suggest are good places in which to start. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tawari, for positioning Trinidad and Tobago in terms of the global space, in terms of the regional space, and highlighting the complexity of the interactions that happens at those levels, and that there is a need to remain cognizant of those connections in planning. At this stage, I would like to hand over to Ms. Deming, and I would like to encourage the audience to interact with us via the chat medium, and also to have your questions prepared, because after all panelists have contributed, what you can do is simply raise your hand, and I would ask you to unmute your mic to direct your questions and comments to the panelists directly. You can also, again, use the chat medium, in which case I can help you direct your questions. So at this time, I'm going to hand over to Ms. Deming. Ms. Deming, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share my views on projects for the projections for the National Budget 2021. This has been an excellent forum that has really brought the community to express views about national issues. You know, in addition to all that has been said about what a national budget does, I come from the perspective of some of the social sciences, and a national budget is also a communication document which actually signals your intentions. It talks about your areas of focus. It indicates the priorities, and it really provides hope and direction to our people. It really addresses the connective tissue that will support the development of this country. So I place my remarks in the context of a society that is reeling from the impact of COVID-19. And at a less kind of overt level, we're reeling from a number of other issues. We have some of our subtleties of race and social, I don't know if to say social equity or social inequality, but those social inequalities are responsible for a lot of what we see as crime and other dysfunctional behavior. There are three brief points which I wish to make. And they are firstly, how do we communicate the end of the dependency on the state for everything? We've over generations developed a dependency attitude, and we now need to change that philosophy. The second comment that I wish to make is about increased productivity, and how do we get a society to move from the laissez-faire attitudes that we've had and that have been almost rewarded to increase productivity. And the third point is, how do we develop real and meaningful ecosystems around our creative economies? Because Trinidad continues to be a creative space. These three themes are particularly challenging for the government because as a society, we tend to transfer our personal power to the state, creating dependence, and that dependence is really unsustainable. I often ask myself, where can I focus in the budget to determine if the government is leading the communication about the change we need now? And one of the economists could probably direct me to exactly where I need to look, but I have not been able to find it. The records indicate that approximately 27 billion are allocated for transfers and subsidies. That's about 50% of the budget. And just that allocation communicates a particular attitude. How do we break that? My first expectation is that this will be significantly reduced and some allocation will be made for the assessment and analysis of the 117 state enterprises which rely on state subventions for their survival. These are organizations which have no inflows, but they get a subvention. No wonder a CEO can be paid $65,000 a month at an organization like Solid Waste Management Company. No wonder a CEO can also have a vehicle valued at more than $1 million and a number of other perks. There ought to be some relationship between the revenue and the profitability of the company and the kind of salaries that they're paid. I know there's a big discussion about if you want the best, you have to pay the best, but I think that something is wrong with the way we have structured those state enterprises. And I would love to see in the budget some allocation that says we're going to take a good look at them and get rid of those that add no real value. At the same time, the PNM's manifesto speaks to creating a special purpose state enterprise specifically designed to help small and medium companies with startup and working capital through grants, soft loans, without onerous conditions. But it achieves this by removing the requirement for audited financials. Reference page 43. Can that truly create strong and sustainable businesses, or is it perpetuating the charity systems that lack accountability? And I know that there has been a particular bit of legislation and the NGO sector is complaining about that because of what is required for them to deliver. My second expectation I have for the budget is a clear indication of how we will treat with issues like productivity, which is underpinned by the ease of doing business that Dr. Hussain referred to earlier. We need to tackle that 105th ranking on the ease of doing business. We need to tackle that aggressively. However, on October 9th, 2019, that's almost a year ago, there was a media report that the then Minister Paula Gopi-Schoon indicated that the consultant Maxwell Stamp PLC was engaged in 2018 and developed a diagnostic review of the institutional framework for trade and business in Trinidad and Tobago. I have not been able to source the report of that consultant, but that report is critical and should be transparent, should be available. Just as a side note, there's something that I have been talking about for at least 5 years, and that is ACT should be our guidance. ACT meaning accountability, collaboration, and transparency. And on those 3 words, we are not doing very, very well. In the budget, I welcome the arrival of the Ministry of Digital Transformation. It will be a new place to focus our hopes and to interrogate the systems that will truly transform and make us today proof and future ready. Those are issues that we need to consider. As part of this thrust towards improving productivity, I expect to understand how the government will develop and improve broadband and cloud infrastructure and create a national digital database, as indicated in the manifesto. And just as a side note, I was quite surprised recently when the Minister of Health was talking about the possibility or whatever of us having a measles outbreak on top of the COVID pandemic, the measles and polio outbreak. And he was urging parents to have their children's immunization cards signed. I was surprised at that. What I would have expected is that the minister would have been able to say to me that we expect to do X number of immunization shots annually. So far, we have done 10%. Now, if you've done that, then I have something that I can go after. But to tell me, go back to the card, it suggests to me that you have not even conceptualized the language of how data can impact the things we do. My third expectation is that we finally see tangible evidence of how we will strengthen, and some people say create an ecosystem where creativity can thrive and become embedded in the development of our country, rather than be viewed as a single artsy sector needing a handout, or people whose language and behaviors we just don't understand. There's an example that I have, that has been brought to my attention by the young people around me. And that is, there's a popular culture movement where young people are creating music and music videos expressing life as they see it. 5 of them have amassed a total of 16 million YouTube views. Now that is phenomenal. They are names you may not know. Rion Elborn has 1.1 million views. Prince Swami has 5.4 million. Trinidad Ghost has 4.8. And K-Lion has 6.5. This movement is sometimes derisively called the Zest or Zessa movement, but they prefer to be called Trini Dance Hall. Both political parties expediently tapped into the vibe of this community in the last election campaign. So there's a recognition that something is happening here. Even if you discount that 16 million views by 50%, there's a trend to be considered. They have learned how to digitally and economically navigate and circumnavigate the systems, and they thrive. Will the budget signal an understanding of how to learn from, support, or demystify this? There's an opportunity here to tap into what they understand and to develop an entire ecosystem which would help materialize creative and innovative ideas. It will stimulate cultural activities in surrounding communities. It will stimulate networking within the sector. And it will reach and communicate with the communities where these artists reside. So if I'm to summarize, Budget 2020 is an opportunity to communicate the end of dependence on the state for everything. But culture is learned behavior, and it means we have to unlearn that dependency. It is an opportunity to reverse the direction of the flow of empowerment, to signal that we're serious about increasing productivity and that we're developing an ecosystem where creativity can thrive. Creativity and thinking is what will take us into the future. How do we communicate to all 1.4 million minds that will think us into tomorrow? I want to end with a quote from the late Robert Kennedy, who said, "Even if we act to erase material poverty, there's another greater task. It is to confront the poverty of satisfaction, purpose, and dignity. It afflicts all of us." Those remarks were made in 1968. And I sincerely hope that we will take counsel from those remarks. Thank you very much, and let me hand back over to Ms. Gookool.
Ms. Deming, thank you very much for highlighting some of the critical governance specific issues. And one of the points that I just want to take away from your presentation is that it is absolutely important that we approach development not as silos the way it had been for so long, but rather in this ecosystem type of way that you have so eloquently explained to us. So at this time, before I continue to take the floor, I would like to invite Mr. Robert Lee Hunt to unmute your mic and you can proceed to make your presentation.
Okay, good night, other members of the panel. Good night, other participants. It is indeed a pleasure to have the opportunity to share my views with this distinguished group of people and with all other members of the listening audience. It's always a little bit difficult coming last after I've heard all these statements. I could start by saying I agree with a lot of what has been said before. But a lot of the conversations before talked about communications. And let me start by saying, I think this is a very pivotal budget that needs to be presented. And we need to change the conversation. And there's a lot of need for communicating the way forward and taking the country into our confidence, especially at this time, in light of where we are and in light of where we need to go. You know, there's something that you learn very quickly in business. A lot of times, however, in communication, I've also learned when you try to communicate, a lot of times when you communicate to someone that they're doing something wrong, I mean, the fallback position is not that I don't like what you say, it's just that I don't like how you say it. The reality is sometimes it is very difficult, but a necessity in this situation. It is not always easy to communicate bad news. Always easy to communicate good news, but it is not always easy to communicate bad news. And the reality of it, the reality of what is facing us is that we are in a situation economically where we are in a little bit of a pickle. The reality of where we are is that, I mean, our core income for Trinidad and Tobago is going to be somewhere in the vicinity of about 34 billion, 35 billion. That's where it has gone to. Our expenditure now is now in the vicinity of 51, 52 billion, 50 billion. That's another reality. It has come down, and we have seen the impact of what happened when over the last 5 years when we brought income, or when the country had to experience bringing expenditure levels from 63 to 50. Now that you are dealing with a core income in the vicinity of 34 billion, it is clear that expenditure needs to be brought a little bit more in line with our reduced level of income that we have. We are also faced with the reality as a country, and again, I'm about the reality checks, that we spend, and I remember the figures when I was around there, we spend about $3.5 billion a month in what is considered non-discretionary expenditure. Expenditure in what we have, paying salaries, giving our subsidy, the amount of money to Tobago, doing all the things, putting some money to UE, and things like that cost anything like about $42 billion. So again, that's another reality check as we talk about the communication. We need to communicate, and I agree. We need to take the population and let the population understand our present reality and how do we move from this point. And therefore, I will be looking at this budget as how do we deal with some of these situations. One of the things that we also have as a reality in the country, and I will expect the budget will have to start to deal with that, is we do have a propensity in Trinidad and Tobago for foreign exchange. We do spend in this country, the central bank injects into the country and has constantly been doing it anywhere in the vicinity of about 1.5 billion US dollars into the economy to meet the shortfall between what is earned and what is spent. So again, That's a reality check that we are presently, and we have to let the country understand those realities and then move together into creating solutions. Now, what are some of these solutions, or what I'll expect some of these solutions to look like? Whatever it is, I've heard, I have seen, I mean, and what Anita was speaking about, there is a lot of unemployment, and there are lots of people at the lower end of the sector, especially, who are experiencing severe hard times. And therefore, whatever is done, the Minister of Finance needs to find a way of how are we going to stimulate this economy? How are we going to jumpstart this economy? This economy has basically not grown for a long while. I mean, it is not now, it has been anemic growth over the last 5 years, but even prior to that, the previous 5 years, we have hovered at 1%, -1%, 0% for a while. So for the past 10 years, we have not seen any significant growth in this economy. But therefore, we now need to jumpstart this economy. So what you are seeing now with the type of unemployment and what's going on in that sector, it's accumulation of some things that have been happening for a while, but it is part of our reality. So I would expect to see some measures geared towards jumpstarting the economy. How do you increase aggregate demand? How do you get some relief to some of the individuals at the lower spectrum of the sector, put some more money in their hands so that they would be able to spend it and stimulate the economy? Because this economy needs some degree of stimulation to take it forward. So I will expect some measures in that regard. We need to measure, we need to curb we need to put some measures in place in dealing with this appetite that we have for foreign exchange. Now, how do we deal with that? Whether we change the price, whether we put some taxes on making those goods a little bit more expensive, but we cannot continue to be stimulating. It is difficult to stimulate demand when people put money in the hands of individuals, and when they spend the money is spent on increasing, on putting pressure on your foreign exchange reserves. So we need to do the two things together. I mean, finally, we also need to find some way in this, as the Minister of Finance addresses the issues that are before him. He needs to find some way of how he is going to stimulate the economic activity also via the business community. So we need to stimulate some business activity in the country, because again, that is something that needs to happen to help deal with our realistic position. To me, one of the factors that as a country we also need to face head on is when you look at some of the literature as it relates to revenue. I mean, you hear, I mentioned about this is an economy that presently have core revenue of about 34 billion. The truth is, the data on all of the tax analysis done and tax people not paying taxes, we do have, as the Minister of Finance said in the last, and again, some of the data that I've read support it. You are talking about Trinidad and Tobago in its present capacity. We live in a very inefficient society. And that level of inefficiency cannot continue. From a tax revenue perspective, over 200,000 people do not pay taxes. And that figure is somewhere in the vicinity of about 10 to 12 billion dollars. That figure, and some of the reports could go up to 15 billion. There is no way, when you look at, we are struggling to balance our budget, and we have been running deficit budgets for the past 10 years. But as a country, we have been giving up via our levels of, or we have been facilitating, we have been allowing, we have been accommodating, whatever word you want, accommodating inefficiencies to the extent of 10 billion, 15 billion by not collecting revenue that is on the ground. That's a low-hanging fruit. And as we adjust to this new normal, we need to improve the efficiency of our country. And therefore, I support areas around digitization. I support areas around reducing transfers and subsidies and the way in which we deal with our subsidies. We cannot continue as a country to give subsidies. And the present way we deal with our subsidies, a lot of our subsidies, we subsidize the rich. So yes, I agree with subsidies, and we have to continue to help people who the disadvantaged, but we cannot continue to subsidizing the rich and the people who could pay. And as we also subsidize individuals who need subsidization and help, we have to have a manner, or we have to develop methods of how to move people away from these subsidies over time. So I agree with Denise when she talks about how do we graduate people and move people away from the dependency syndrome whilst continuing to help them and transition them. But what I do know is that we cannot continue the way in which we do our subsidies, where a lot of the people who could afford to pay, the country is presently carrying them with subsidies. So that's also part of the inefficiency. So in all, I mean, you need, as a country, I mean, I have to ask myself, we cannot live as citizens. There's a reality check. There's a communication mechanism that needs to be put there to let people understand that we have to tighten up this economy. We cannot continue the level of inefficiencies that existed in the past. We need to put measures in place to deal with the revenue leakages. We need to put measures in place to make sure that our expenditure and we do more with less, and our subsidies are put to better use. We need to put measures in place to curb the demand for foreign exchange that we have, or the propensity of needing goods with foreign exchange. We need to increase some sort of, inside there, some sort of measures for agriculture substitution. So increase the production of agriculture, so we use less foreign exchange in there. So all of those are things I will expect. But we are in a position where income is going to be somewhere like 34, 35 billion. And last known expenditure was at 50 billion. And how do we move down? How do we bring this country down from expecting 50 billion when our income, our core income is now 30, 35 billion? How do we deal with that short-term problem? And then how do we deal with it in the long-term problem and keep our society together? Because we do have some racial tensions to deal with. We do have some income distribution issues to deal with. And we are presently in a pickle with regard to some of the social programs, and the levels of unemployment in the country is also relatively high. So that, in summary, is my contribution. And as I said, is what some of the things that I would like to see addressed in light of our present prevailing environment. And those are, as I said, that's some of the environment that I see the Minister of Finance will need to be dealing with upfront with the population, and bringing all parties need a part to play in navigating us through this situation. I thank you.
Mr. Lehan, thank you so much for your contribution. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open up the floor now. What I would invite you to do is please use the raise hand function, and I will invite you to unmute your mic and direct your questions to the panelists. In the meantime, while our audience is collating their questions, I just want to put out to Dr. Hussain, Dr. Tawari, and Ms. Haynes, how do either of you expect that the government will go about reducing transfers and subsidies? And Specifically to Dr. Hossain, a question has come in from the audience. How does the government approach reducing the import bill and improving export revenue? Any one of the panelists can take the questions while our audience collates their questions.
Can I?
Sure, Ms. Deming, go ahead.
The non-quantitative person on the group. There's some simple things that I think we can do in terms of reducing our imports and therefore reducing our need for foreign exchange. This country does not need another car to be imported. In 2018, Singapore stopped the importation of cars unless you were decommissioning one and getting another one, so that they got to a zero increase in cars. So that's one thing we can do. Every time I pass by any of those car parks where the foreign use or the new cars reside, what I see is thousands of dollars that this country need not import. A second thing this country need not do is we need not give another franchise to anybody. We don't need any more franchises. So those are two things that we can do. And with regard to reducing subsidies and transfers, we need to identify where our population is, because we don't know who is who. We don't know, we don't have a number, we can't find them. We must never be in a situation again in which there's a crisis and we don't know that there are 10 children on street X in community Y. Otherwise, what we are doing is handing out things, handing out money, handing out goods without proper data. And that simply encourages people to continue the dependency and to continue to take advantage of the system. So those are three suggestions from the non-quantitative person.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deming. And just as a follow-on question, how do you think the social culture of Trinidad and Tobago could be changed away from the handout mentality that you alluded to in your presentation? So what we can do, we can take the round of answers and we can come back to you in a few minutes. Any of the other panelists, you can take the floor at this time.
Okay, just one quick intervention, Rebecca. On the point of how do we need to know where our population is, I want to agree with Ms. Deming 100% on that, because once the COVID-19, and that's why I wanted to make clear that crisis is a time that you can really innovate, right? We don't have to look at it as woe is Trinidad right now. Because we had, yes, the crisis hit and you had to get aid to a number of persons. If I were the government, I would have used this opportunity to do a massive data collection, understanding where people are, who is in need, etc. Not simply just trying a mass giveaway, but it struck me as a person who is now, in the representative space, how little information we actually have about our citizens. So last week we were told via a release from the Ministry of Education that members of parliament would be given 500 meals to distribute to families for children, for families, right? So I had a couple of questions. How do we know? How are we allocating this? Are you using the school feeding program? And we weren't able to answer any of these questions. The Ministry of Social Development, Ministry of Education, nobody's able to answer the questions about how are you getting assistance, but we would constantly hear announcements about things to be done, but no targeted approaches and intervention. And it goes to also what Mr. LaHunt said, which is this idea of ensuring that we are getting things to persons in need. Over time, yes, the budget is a statement of intent and you would look at prioritization, but as a nation, are we working towards ensuring that we aren't just spending money and throwing money at a problem, but that we are actually making an attempt to identify the problem and come up with a cogent, targeted solution? And that's the only way we'll really move forward, if we are committed to really doing what we say we intend to do.
Thank you very much, Ms. Haynes. Dr. Tawari, would you like to post a comment or response? Dr. Tawari, you may need to unmute your mic.
Yeah, in the phase that we are in, we are going to have to recognize that we have a pre-vaccine period and a post-vaccine period that will come. And a lot of the developmental things that we want to do for expansion of the economy with an outward focus outside of the energy sector are not going to happen just like that, including the investment input from outside. And we have to have a kind of sovereignty approach, a self-sufficiency approach, inclusion and equity approach in the economic system to building the kind of national capacity we need to have in the human population or citizens, as well as to create the sectors that can thrive on an economy that is now really where consumer demand is down and where you really need to stimulate that economy internally. That is why the agricultural thrust is so very important. But we must remember that part of the agriculture is to dampen imports so that you can have increased production and productivity in that area. And you can link it to the things that are export oriented in terms of industry based on these outputs from agricultural production. We also have the manufacturing sector and the services sector. Roger talked about that early. And we need to have those expand in order to create jobs. But chances are that with low demand at home and with the difficulties in the export market abroad, they may not be able to advance exports to the level that they might in a normal, well-integrated global economy, and where demand is down everywhere. So I think we have to take that pre-vaccine period as a way of preparing for the post-vaccine period when our economy can take off. So agriculture is one of the ways, manufacture is one of the ways, services are one of the ways, and we seem to be headed in the area of digitization, which would be good for this industry. For time to do certain things that we need to do for ourselves. The issue of water capture, flood, irrigation, culture, and to support food production in the country. We could have a massive project nationally, which is centrally organized, which is realized through the Ministry of Local Government to the local government areas, and which can integrate 600 communities in this country. And we have 14 regional groups, regional governments in the country. And we can decentralize in such a fashion that you really bring people from the communities into the production process to create future assets for the Trinidad and Tobago economy, to stop the flooding, to deal with the question of retention ponds and so on. As part of a water plan, you need a much more complex plan than that. But you also to support irrigation and to create jobs in the society. You can also deal with environmental issues. I remember, I mean, if you prevented quarrying on the hill, if you dealt with deforestation and you dealt with slash and burn agriculture in the hills, those issues. We have so many coastal problems that we are aware of now. Some of them have projects attending to them. But what I am saying is a time in the pre-vaccine period to do all the things that we could do for ourselves, to raise the production capacity, to do the import substitution, to skill people for jobs that will be coming. So if you divide, let's say, the next 3 years into the pre-vaccine and the post-vaccine period, pre-vaccine for internal economic propulsion and the building of national assets. You could also support the tourism trust, which is not going to catch itself for another 2.5 years, 3 years, but you could build the destination infrastructure, you could build capacity, you could do beautification things, etc. All of these things that you can do if you have this notion of, if you understand the implications for a pre-vaccine period and the takeoff possibilities in post-vaccine. So I am saying that the situation is not as difficult or as horrible as it seems. Somebody mentioned the business of a time for creativity when you're under pressure like this. And I think that this is a time when we have to understand that what we need to do is to focus on national sovereignty, on self-sufficiency, on productivity, on economic inclusion, and more than that, prepare the society for less imports and the higher production with the possibility of exports when the vaccine is found and people now begin to respond to the freedom that that will give in the global social system, but also the economic system, as well as because we are going to get there eventually.
Dr. Tawari, thank you very much for your contribution. Dr. Hussain, I'm going to hand over to you before we go back to Ms. Deming. Dr. Hussain? Dr. Hussain, you're going to have to unmute your mic, please.
Hello.
Hi, yes, go ahead. We're hearing you.
Rebecca, are you all seeing the screen?
Yes, Dr. Hussain, go ahead.
Okay. So we have a situation in which our national income in Trinidad and Tobago, and I saw Robert refer to the time period, it's actually from 2008 after, I would say, Robert, from 2009 in particular down to 2020, we have had an average growth rate of about minus 0.1%. So the average for sure is negative. And only twice in that time period, we had economic growth over 2%. In fact, we will take until 2030 to get back to 2008 if we assume a growth rate after 2020 of 2%. And we would have produced about 7 billion barrels of oil and gas equivalent, which is amazing in terms of the magnitude of the bust phase of the boom bust cycle. But let's look at this Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M equation here. This is simply how income in a country is determined. C is consumption, I is investment, G is government expenditure, X is exports, and M is imports. So in this 2021 budget, we know that consumption, another budget in the economy, consumption will be down because a lot of people have lost income. Some people, their disposable income has fallen because their part-time jobs and the extra money they would make via taxi fares, and the landlords who are unable to collect rents from some of their tenants. For a number of reasons, consumption would fall. Marginal propensity to consume may rise, but the consumption level would fall. Also, you just heard Dr. Tiwari, Anita, and Robert in different ways mention government expenditure and the fiscal deficit, which is the overall fiscal deficit potentially being around 20 billion, which means that the non-energy fiscal deficit would probably be about 25 billion. And that's what I focus on. I always focus on the non-energy fiscal deficit and the primary balance. So G as a method to stimulate Y is not on the equation or not on the horizon, and C as a method to stimulate Y is not on the horizon, except one that may argue that if you reconstitute the way government expenditure is spent and you reduce transfers and subsidies by about 7 billion, which I think is possible, and increase capital injections by about 4 billion out of that 7 billion, you may possibly, by virtue of the composition of G, although G overall being lower, the change in composition could favorably affect Y, and I take that argument. But the two groups of variables that remain as options to stimulate Y in 2021, and the minister should be very strongly focused on, in fact, he should have been focused on this from 2016, is I and X minus M. And this is what makes me extremely annoyed, because this is obvious, even tough. I think in A-levels, I was once involved with the A-level syllabus, and this is on the A-level syllabus. In a situation like this, if you have to stimulate I, if the government is contracting because they don't have money and for a number of reasons, and they are running persistent expansionary policy and it's not leading to growth, other sectors of the equation have to come into play. So to boost I, my view is that you have to fix the factors that facilitate investment. So we have tried lowering the interest rate at the banks. Mr. Imbert has also tried an internal devaluation. He has cut government expenditure from 63 billion down to 53 billion, which I think was a remarkable exercise. And he kept it so for about 5 years, which was just as remarkable, although in the later years he should have lowered it. But the internal devaluation won't work. An internal devaluation working through keeping inflation rates low will take until 2084. I worked it out to correct the real effective exchange rate. So you can't go the route of an internal devaluation alone. You have to find a means to stimulate I. And I'm saying that the means to stimulate I is to bring the ease of doing business ranking from a rank of 105 down to about 40. And I am hoping that some of you here in this room have the capacity to pass this message on to Minister Imbert and others. Put the 6 relevant PS in a small room and tell them, listen, you can't come out of this room, and it's a joking format, but I'm serious, until you bring the ease of doing business rank down. And if you are the line minister in charge of the ease of doing business ranking and you do not change it within 1 year, you are going to be having to look for a job. Because I has the potential to keep Y buoyant if we could inflate I. And so the ease of doing is a very important channel, but there's another channel, export minus imports. If we could influence exports, in particular, look at the lease out farm out agreement. This produces about 22%, if I remember correctly, of the output of heritage as a whole, and it has increased from about 7% over a 10-year period. There is a low-hanging fruit there that if we give some of the more mature wells to the private sector with private sector capital and private sector discipline, the output of of crude oil and mature wells would increase. Also, if we look at the arrangement with BP and EOG, where BP had a stranded gas field, their overheads were too high, and they partnered with a smaller, more nimble player, and they brought the gas on field via EOG. I think we could bring some more stranded gas on stream. So that's on the energy side. On the non-energy side, I think the E-Tech Park is a tremendous vehicle to bring 20 more firms, either working with the diaspora or targeted only to the diaspora and the extra-regional market to bring export revenue earning firms on stream. No new firms in the E-Tech Park bringing in goods only for the local market. No, we can't afford that. I really love the idea that Denise Deming said. I did a quick search, Denise. I couldn't verify that Singapore had banned or had stopped importing new cars. I will chat with you after about it. But I think that's an absolutely brilliant idea in the new normal. We need to say to folks, listen, we cannot afford to spend foreign exchange on new cars for 3 years unless it's some kind of extremely bad situation. Drive what you have. Make it work. The other thing in relation to X, apart from the E-Tech Park, comes back again to the special economic zone policy that the Ministry of Trade is pushing. We need to move that from the policy format stage past the legislation and action it. And that's another area where I think we could get some export revenues. In terms of the export side again, I don't understand why the Ministry of Trade is not calculating what are the possibilities for the export sector. So there's something called trade can analysis. You can use trade can analysis. Say, for example, you are trading with South America. So you could look at what Trinidad and Tobago has a comparative advantage in capacity to export, what South America is importing, and therefore you could find the goods in the middle in which we have the capacity to export and that are on the upswing of the international product cycle in South America. So therefore the probability of failure by backing those goods is very small. And you go to the Exim Bank with a list and you back those type of goods. Similarly, in terms of imports, you can calculate a block of goods for which we have import substituting potential, not willy-nilly. And you put those goods to the Exim Bank and say, if someone wants to bring in these goods or to the commercial bank, we can back it because they would, if someone wants to produce those goods, because they would be saving the country on the use of scarce foreign exchange. And the last point in relation to how to try to increase Y, because that's what we want, ideas to increase Y in this troubled environment, is use the Venezuelan labor. I can't understand why we have an ad hoc open market policy for Venezuelan labor, which means, and I'm trying to be as factual as I could here, others may know better, that the beautiful Venezuelan women would go in the bars and those type of places, the Trini men would go, more Johnny Walker blue and red and black and white would sell, and therefore our imports would rise, and that's not good. We put these Venezuelan workers, similar to the apple picking program, to work in areas that either generate foreign exchange or save on the use of foreign exchange. And in my view, from where I sit in a different place to some of the policymakers here, I see that as giving X minus M a chance, and I a chance, and therefore by extension, Y a chance. I hope that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. Ms. Deming, I would like you to go ahead to proceed to answer the question. And just as an added question for Mr. Lee Hunt and Dr. Tawari and Ms. Haynes as well, how do you expect that the government will go about trimming their expenditure and reducing the overall size of the government sector? Ms. Deming, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My recollection of the question is, the question had to do with what would I suggest to reduce the dependency on the state?
Yes, that is correct.
I remember the question.
The culture of dependency.
The culture of dependency. The first thing that we have to do is to reduce expectations. implicit in everything that governments do and have been doing for many years is an expectation that we will take care of our tribe. If you reduce that kind of expectation, then nobody's going to be as dependent on you.
That's
The
true.
second thing that the second issue that I wish to bring to the table is that we operate, the government has too much of a large hand in everything. So in the chat, there's conversation about that business relies on government just as much as the poorer people and so on. The difference with business is that they are able to take whatever investment or whatever money that is available and create a value chain and create a product and create a need. What we are having is intergenerational dependency on the state. So the second thing the state has to do is to stop introducing programs that increase or encourage dependency. We have DOOD, CPEP. We have programs that go back from since I was a child. You have people in programs now who are asking for retirement benefits when the program was originally designed just to give them a hand up for a short time. So the government has to stop introducing the programs. The third thing that the government has to do is to manage what it is responsible for. A lot of issues are management issues. When people talk to me about low productivity, I am very clear that low productivity is a management issue. Your inability to work with the unions is a management issue, because I have seen on both sides of the divide, when people are in opposition, they and the unions work very well. What happens when you get into power? So I'm saying that the culture of dependency can be unlearned, just as we fostered it and we created it and we developed it and we even rewarded people for depending. We have to just stop it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deming. And definitely those are excellent conversation starters. Mr. Lee Hunt, go ahead.
Yes, all right. I just wanted to jump in here on a few points and deal with the particular one I talked about. How do we go about reducing expenditure? But I agree with the point that was last made with regard to there is a need. I mean, having been in the government myself, I myself was surprised about how inefficient, and that's why I put under a heading of improving the efficiency of how we govern is critical. And I think the idea about digitization of the economy, I think we all have to have a watchful eye on government and ensure that that is put in place. I think this government has spoken a lot of it in its manifesto. They spoke a lot of it about, this identity, unique identity. Those are the solutions. And I will expect somewhere in the budget that we start to move along that pinnacle to move towards there. Because yes, a lot of the ways in how we disburse some of our social programs now, they are not very efficient because we don't have the required level of data. And that's one way of solving the problem going forward. I think, yes, we need to look at the whole idea of giving incentives. And again, in this budget, so I expect something on digitization and moving that forward. I expect something with regard to giving some type of incentive for agriculture, because I agree, agriculture substitution is important. And not only just agriculture in the traditional form, but incentives in bringing technology into agriculture. Because we have to change the way in which the perception of who is a farmer and what are the type of business that a farmer is in. So if you introduce technology into agriculture, we could increase our production a lot more, and we could produce a lot of things that we feel we can't produce in Trinidad. We could start to produce it here, all right? So I think this budget should deal with some sort of incentives. I mean, the idea of a government standing up and saying no importation of cars, yes, I think that's eventually what we would like to achieve. But I think the way to achieve some of these things is not actually to say it like that, but to actually make them exorbitant or very expensive to happen. or ensure that people use their own foreign exchange. I am not sure. I am not sure, as we try to communicate, that the way to do it is just to say that we can't do it, but I will expect that there should be a revision of our, across the board, not only cars, but all luxury goods, all luxury items. We have to make them more expensive or very expensive, so that via taxations, so that we will curb the demand for them. And therefore, I would expect, as we try to balance the limited amount of foreign exchange and recognize that it is a scarce resource, that we do have to curb via taxation, making goods very expensive, so that at least they will no longer be able to be purchased that easily. I expect, as I said, I think the government needs to focus. When you look at the levels of expenditure of what it is that government spends money on, a big part of that money comes from personal expenditure. A big part of it comes from transfers and subsidies. And I did mention that we need to look at how we deal with our subsidies at this point in time. So we need to, for example, I mean, WASA, T&Tech are two typical examples whereby we give these subsidies to T&Tech via the cost of gas. And that subsidy is passed on to every citizen. So when I say you have to look at how we give out these subsidies, and we have to make sure by putting graduation programs or allowing for the RIC to do their work in ensuring that those prices, we need to let people understand the cost of, if I had the cost in T&Tech of producing electricity. This is the cost. This is your bill. I am going to give you as a government a subsidy, and I will give you that subsidy based on some sort of income criteria. So the person who is at the top end of the scale, we talk about them as the 1%, they should pay the real cost associated with electricity, and others. So the subsidy program needs to be adjusted in that way. I think we have to also try to, as I said, with regard to other areas of expenditure, at this point in time, I mean, the other areas of personal expenditure, goods and services, the idea that Denise was talking about dependency syndrome, yes, I agree. We need to, and I mentioned that early, again, we have something, and we cannot also expect a budget. A budget needs to send a signal, but a budget needs to also do things with the present reality. Some of these social programs, you can't just stop them. It can't happen just like that. You can't get up and say stop. But I agree with you, we need to start to signal some sort of mechanism whereby, and again, this will happen when you get proper data of how do we graduate people out of those programs, so that we will be able to say you are on the program, but you will be on this program for a certain length of time. And we try to inculcate programs of education and other training programs, so we move people out of these programs. I want to just jump back one more what I said with agriculture. Again, incentives to deal with agriculture and to deal with putting technology into agriculture. The fact is, and we have to link some of the other services that government produce. For example, government produces about 84,000 meals. 84,000 meals in the school feeding program. Between the school feeding program and other commitments of government, the prisons, other individuals, other meals that they produce, is close to 130,000 meals. I think we would see in this, I would like to see the government doing some programs, and I expect that they will, coming out of the reports, you will start to see a focus and a better alignment of the agriculture the meals and the use of the agriculture products and alignment of that with our agriculture sector. So I would like to see some things like that put in place in the budget so that we will give the people in agriculture focus on direction as to exactly what do we want them to produce. We will put mechanisms in place to allow them to produce it using technology, and therefore we will have immediate markets for them in the products that they're using. And that's just management and alignment of the things that we presently do. So I will expect that some of those things, so a combination of all of those things is what I would see the government needing to do to try to cut expenditure on a gradual basis, all right, in some of the key areas of transfers and subsidies specifically, right? And then I expect in the revenue side to increase. I know Ms. Haynes always talk about taxation, but I need to use taxation in this regard on luxury goods so as to curb the demand. And again, I go back to it. We have, ladies and gentlemen, about $15 billion on the ground in this country. If you think about Trinidad and Tobago, if you think about Trinidad and Tobago underperforming, we have had 15 billion, 10 to 15 billion of taxes not collected in this country for the past 10 years. That is $150 billion. When you think about Trinidad and Tobago as an economy, when you look at the levels of our deficit, what could we do, what could be done with $150 billion? And therefore, that is in the past, that has happened. We need to ensure that our revenue collection, because it is not fair for those of us who pay our taxes, for us to be having the level of taxation not being collected. And if we focus on that, we will go a long way in not having to focus on the cutting of critical expenditure, so as to not make life even more difficult than it is.
That's true. Mr. Leon, thank you very much for your contribution. I noticed, Ms. Haynes, you had your hand up. You can go ahead and unmute your mic to make your contribution.
Thank you, Rebecca. This is just on Mr. Lahan's point on agriculture and aligning our policies. So yes, we've heard a lot about agriculture incentives, etc. And in my opening statement, I spoke about collaboration and ensuring that persons are brought to the decision-making table. In Tabaquite, we have the Tabaquite farmers, the Lightbourne farmers, the Tortuga farmers, amongst many others. They've been able to do so much with little, doing more with less, as Mr. Lahan always says. And they've been able to do that with the on their own. And these are very innovative, very talented people, and they are not brought into the consultation and at the decision-making table when we're deciding how much money to put towards agriculture, how to maximize the use. They are left out. So decisions are made in one space without the people who are doing the job, right? And then they're handing down and then they're saying, well, why can't we make the most of it? And this is where the collaboration is key, and having respect for those who are in the industry. It is just like Ms. Deming said in the earlier, talking about the Zessa movement and Trinidad dancehall. And if you take that conversation wider to the context of the creative art and the culture industry, people who are doing the work, building their name, building their stature, and building Trinidad and Tobago are left out completely on the decision making about what happens to that industry at all times. So the industries that we are going to depend on to be innovative, to create, to reduce the dependency syndrome, to give people opportunities, we do not include the people who are doing it now into decision making. And until we fix that, we aren't going forward at all.
Thank you very much, Ms. Haynes. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all but out of our time this evening, so I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to wrap up in their closing comments, and if there are any other outstanding contributions that they would like to make. Dr. Tawari, may I ask that you go first? Dr. Tawari, you may need to unmute your mic.
Yeah.
Dr. Tawari, you may need to unmute your mic, please.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right. I would say that we have about $7 billion worth of foreign exchange, which at a rate of depletion up to now about $1.6 billion a year, it probably is less now, is not going to last us very long. And we have a situation also in which we have almost reached the limit of being able to dip into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which is not too much more than $4 billion, beyond which, when it gets to 4 billion, you can't touch it anymore. And therefore, the crying need is really to have foreign exchange earnings as a means of fueling economic activity in a situation where our main source of foreign exchange revenue is really, really underperforming, both because of production and price. That's the energy sector. So we don't have an alternative. We have to do the things that cause us to bring productivity to the table to produce the things that we can produce in Trinidad and Tobago. We have to reduce the import bill. There is no way that we can afford that, avoid that. We have to find a way of getting our existing sectors, agriculture, manufacture, services, to export more. There is no way that we can get away from doing that. And we need to attract new investments in new areas, like the green areas that I mentioned earlier, but also in the new technology areas as we try to digitize, but also build a new economy, because COVID has shown that everything is changing and moving in the direction of technology. And we need to take the changes that are actually taking place in our time to try and reconfigure the economy that we will have to engage at some time in the future. So that foreign exchange imperative, the reason I raised that, is a necessity. If you do not have foreign exchange, you will not be able to buy anything that you need that you cannot produce. And therefore, it should be a kind of stimulus now to get us to move in that. We talk about diversification, but it really has to do with restructuring the existing production base, our existing markets, etc., so that the diversification can take place at different levels, including diversification of investment sources. And I would say, if we keep an eye on the foreign exchange, the productivity matter internally, and we keep an eye on living within our means as we begin to transform the economy, we will be on a good track.
Agreed. Thank you very much, Dr. Tawari. Ms. Deming, may I invite you to offer your closing comments? You would need to unmute your mic, Ms. Deming.
Yes, I unmuted my Thank you very much for the opportunity to just share some of the views that I have. And if I can put in a couple plugs, it would be for data, that if there's any focus we need to put, it has to be on data so that we understand who we are, where we are, and what people actually need. The second area that I would love to see in something in the budget is this creation and development and refinement of the creative sector, because I do believe that that is where our future lies. You know, the economists there know that oil and gas is no longer a conversation. So the only thing we have is ourselves. And the third comment I wish to make is that we cannot ask people to do things that we are not doing. So the leaders need to lead by example and live in a way that the followers want to emulate. So if the leaders are still living high off their hog, then nobody's going to change their behavior. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deming. Mr. Lee Hunt, may I ask you to offer your closing comments?
Yes. All right. Okay. Again, you know, I am a practical person, I must say, and again, I always try to think about I agree with all that is being said. And again, the big thing is about how do we go about doing them and what do we need to do? So one of the things that I would like to see us do there, I agree with that with Denise, the creative sector is something we need to focus on. I think the creative sector, I think the film industry is one particular area that we need to focus on. And I think we need to do a little bit of work and put some incentives inside that particular area to see that particular area grow. And again, use our two populations that we have, our two pivotal populations, the African and the Indo population, and have some linkages in the filmmaking industry with Hollywood, with Bollywood and Nollywood, Nigeria and India. I think there are lots of opportunities for job creation because we need to get new jobs and stimulate jobs in this for us to move forward. I think we need to, again, this budget is a face the reality of our predicament. Right? I think we are going to go forward. I think our core revenue is not going to get up in the immediate short term to 40 billion. It's going to be where it is, and therefore it's going to be around 35, 34 billion. And that's I mean, that's not what we would like it to happen, but because of foreign and indigenous forces, and therefore we have to then start to manage the level of deficit that we could live with in the country in light of that level of revenue that we will be collecting. And therefore it would require a certain degree of adjustments that needs to be put in place. Again, another industry which we haven't spoken a lot about that I think has the potential for job creation and also helping on the export side by allowing us to export more gas is the whole idea of energy efficiency and energy conservation and renewable energy. I think that particular industry has the potential of creating a lot of jobs. So we need to put some incentives inside there. So I'm looking at putting incentives, and I hope the Minister of Finance will put incentives in areas in the budget that will stimulate job creation. I mean, that is going to be critical in the short term because, as Ms. Haynes said, we do have a lot of people who are facing a lot of hard times. I mean, and we need to try to see how we're going to give them. I think we even, in spite of how situations are, I will expect for us to even venture and give some more relief, tax relief to individuals at the lower end. Why not consider moving the ban from 6,000 or for 72,000 to 84,000? In that way, give a little bit more people, a larger group of people at the lower end of the spectrum, tax-free income, which will allow for them to spend a lot more and which will go a long way in increasing aggregate demand. So we need to find those ways and we need to do those practical things whilst we set Trinidad on a path of how do we run this country more efficiently in everything that we do, both on the revenue side and both on the expenditure side, and we get more value for what we are doing. Finally, I mean, as we talk about the communication, you know, we are our worst enemies. And I think we all agree of what the numbers, that what I said there, those are the numbers. The numbers are 34, and we presently spending 3.5 billion a month, which is 42 billion in core expenditure. So we can't continue like that. But clearly the Minister of Finance are going to have to do some things, and he's not going to do everything because there's going to be a balancing act that is required. I think the communication that we have among ourselves, i.e. our leaders, i.e. our politicians, i.e. even us, our commentators, we have to find a way in the country of stop demonizing each other. Because as we do that, we almost make the country believe that, well, this person is putting these measures in place because they don't like you. And I think in doing that, we are not doing anything for the country as a whole. So I think the communication, how we communicate, I think the conversation that we want to carry together, we the people on this panel, and whatever class you want to put us in, and then the politicians, everyone, we have to sort of carry a general conversation that, listen, it cannot be business as usual. There are certain things that we need to do differently. We need to adjust. We need to bring this level of, we cannot continue the level of expenditure and the waste in the level of revenue that presently exists. And I think overall, that is what I would like to see us happening. So those are some of my things that I wanted to add on. I mean, energy efficiency, energy conservation, some specific things in the creative industry, all right, that we need to see in the budget. But the demonizing and the type of the way in which we communicate and the message that we send to the general population that it cannot be business as usual is one that I hope we will also, that the budget will also, that the conversations after the budget will also pattern itself around.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lehans. Ms. Haynes, may I ask you to unmute your mic and offer your closing comments?
Okay. Yes, thank you, Rebecca. And thank you everyone for the level of participation that we saw tonight. I personally very much appreciate being part of the panel and this discussion. My closing comments is just that we must remember that innovation can only happen in a crisis. And we are, yes, we have found ourselves in a crisis. It is a global crisis. But Trinidad and Tobago has the human resources, all of the human resources that we need to really make a difference. And it is to tap into that and tap into that spirit of ingenuity and get our country working together and working for the benefit of all of us. I hope that on October 5th, that we don't simply hear numbers and that we remember that the economy is people. That's what we're talking about. No matter what numbers they give us, we are talking about human beings. We are talking about our neighbors, our friends, each and every one of us. And that is very important with how we go forward with not just the conversation, but our policy making. It is also very important as we approach October 5th and beyond that we also start to think about whatever the government does. We as citizens really need to ensure that our voices are heard for more effective and efficient representation. We need to bridge that gap between what is being said and done at a political level or at a and make sure that it directly impacts our lives and the lives of and that we are feeling. So if we're told $6 billion is going to be spent on education, that we understand where that $6 billion is being spent and we see the improvement, and we aren't simply throwing money at problems that we haven't clearly identified. And that way we will start to move towards more efficient governance and what we're all talking about that we expect to see as Trinidad and Tobago moves forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Haynes. Dr. Hossain, I'd like you to unmute your mic and offer your closing comments, please.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I'd like to say thanks for all for joining. You know, the background work of Rebecca and Christian City, we have to mention it. Thanks very much, Rebecca and Christian, for managing and facilitating this conversation. Thanks to the panelists for, you know, you could see the deep reflection and a sense of care coming out from the panelists about the economy, and that's very heartwarming. We hope that we could translate that and push that message out there. You know, we emphasize communication, put that message out there that we are all in this together. And sometimes we may put out ideas that others may find tough, but we are just searching for ideas and searching for solutions to move this ship Trinidad and Tobago forward in one piece. In closing, I'd like to say the two takeaways for me that synchronize into one point is improving the current account balance whilst reducing the fiscal balance. And that's where, on that one point with two parts, I really hope to see the Minister of Finance make several pronouncements on October the 5th. And even as after that, I hope that the goodly people on this panel, you know, we keep putting our views out in the public domain. There would be different ways that the minister and other policymakers could take whatever ideas we may have that may be useful in this trying time to carry our economy forward. And we continue to do that. I particularly like the comment by Ms. Deming on the car imports, and I'm definitely going to be looking at that Singaporean model some more and seeing if there is any value for my people and our people in Trinidad and Tobago. And so with that, I thank you all. And this was really an excellent session. We had reached up to 78 people. We normally stop at 8:45 and we are past 9. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hossain, and to the rest of the panel, thank you for your time and your indulgence and for sharing your experience with us. So with that, I'm saying good night and stay safe to everyone, and look out for the correspondences for our upcoming sessions. Bye. Good night.